Imagine waking up on a quiet Sunday morning, expecting nothing more dramatic than a peaceful spring day, only to hear that an entire mountain has exploded, not cracked, not erupted like a postcard volcano with glowing rivers of lava. Exploded in less than a minute, one of America's most beautiful mountains transformed into one of the most destructive natural disasters in its history. What's even harder to believe is that this catastrophe didn't come without warning. For nearly 2 months, the mountain had been trying to tell everyone something was terribly wrong. The ground shook hundreds of times a day. Steam burst from new cracks near the summit. The north side of the mountain began swelling outward, growing almost 5 feet every single day, as if something unimaginably powerful was pushing from deep below. Scientists watched it happen in real time. Helicopters flew overhead. Instruments recorded every tremor. Newspapers covered the story almost daily. Yet despite all of those warnings, people still refused to leave. Some believed the experts were exaggerating. Others had lived near the mountain their entire lives and insisted it had always been peaceful. Loggers continued working in nearby forests. Property owners argued that the danger zones were too large. Tourists drove as close as they could, hoping to witness nature's greatest show. A few even sneaked past police barricades because they thought the restrictions were unnecessary. Then there was one man who ignored every evacuation order because he simply couldn't imagine abandoning the place he loved. His name would soon become one of the most remembered stories of the disaster. But perhaps the biggest surprise isn't that people ignored the warnings. It's that the scientists themselves were preparing for the wrong kind of eruption. Most volcanoes erupt straight upward. Mount St. Helens had a completely different plan. Deep inside the mountain, pressure was building in a direction almost nobody expected. The mountain wasn't just becoming unstable, it was quietly preparing one of the largest landslides ever recorded on Earth. And when that hidden weakness finally gave way, the explosion didn't shoot into the sky first. It blasted sideways. The force flattened entire forests in seconds. Trees snapped like toothpicks across hundreds of square miles. Rivers instantly filled with ash and debris. The blast traveled faster than the speed of sound, destroying everything in its path before many people even realized what had happened. From miles away, witnesses described a black cloud swallowing the daylight while the landscape itself seemed to disappear. And perhaps the strangest part of all is this: the eruption could have been far worse. Under slightly different conditions, the death toll might have reached into the thousands. Entire communities were closer to disaster than most Americans ever realized. A few decisions, a few lucky circumstances, and even the exact day of the week changed the outcome forever. So how did an apparently peaceful mountain transform into one of the most powerful explosions in modern American history? Why were so many warning signs dismissed despite being visible for weeks? And what did scientists learn from Mount St. Helens that now helps protect millions of people living near dangerous volcanoes around the world? Because this isn't just the story of a volcano, it's the story of how nature gave America dozens of chances, and how, despite all the warnings, history came within moments of taking an even darker turn. Long before Mount St. Helens became synonymous with disaster, it was known for something entirely different: beauty. If you had asked someone in the Pacific Northwest during the 1970s to name the most picturesque mountain in the region, many would not have chosen the towering bulk of Mount Rainier or the glacier-covered summit of Mount Adams. They would have pointed instead to a smaller, almost perfectly symmetrical peak rising gracefully above endless forests. Its elegant cone seemed almost too perfect to be real, especially when reflected in the calm waters of Spirit Lake on a clear summer morning. From a distance, it looked peaceful, stable, almost timeless. It was the kind of mountain that inspired postcards, paintings, and family photo albums. On weekends, station wagons packed with camping gear wound their way through narrow mountain roads. Children leaned against the windows, waiting for their first glimpse of the snow-capped summit. Fishermen rose before dawn to cast lines into lakes so clear that the surrounding evergreens seemed to continue beneath the water's surface. Hikers spent entire days exploring trails that climbed through old-growth forests scented with cedar and pine. For countless Americans, Mount St. Helens wasn't merely a mountain. It was part of their happiest memories. The mountain stood in southwestern Washington, roughly halfway between Seattle and Portland, in a landscape shaped by extraordinary natural forces. Thick forests blanketed rolling hills. Rivers carved through volcanic rock before eventually reaching the mighty Columbia River. Snow lingered on the higher elevations well into summer, feeding streams that nourished one of the richest forest ecosystems in North America. To outsiders, it looked untouched. But this landscape had been under construction for millions of years. To understand why Mount St. Helens existed at all, you have to look far beneath the forests and even beneath the Pacific Ocean itself. Off the western coast of North America, an immense geological process has been unfolding for tens of millions of years. A massive slab of oceanic crust, known as the Juan de Fuca Plate, slowly slides beneath the North American continent. It moves only a few inches each year, about as fast as fingernails grow, but over millions of years that slow movement has enormous consequences. As the oceanic plate sinks deep into Earth's mantle, intense heat and pressure cause parts of it to melt. The resulting magma, lighter than the surrounding rock, begins rising toward the surface. Sometimes it cools underground, never reaching daylight. Sometimes it doesn't. Over countless eruptions separated by decades, centuries, or even thousands of years, volcanoes gradually rise above the landscape. This process created the Cascade Range, a chain of volcanoes stretching from northern California through Oregon and Washington into British Columbia. Many people know the names of these mountains today: Mount Rainier, Mount Hood, Mount Shasta, Mount Baker, Mount Adams, Lassen Peak. But in the late 20th century, few Americans thought of them primarily as volcanoes. They were simply mountains, snow-covered landmarks, vacation destinations, part of the scenery. That perception existed for a simple reason. Human beings judge danger by experience. If your grandparents never witnessed an eruption, and your parents never witnessed one, it becomes easy to assume the mountain has finished whatever work nature intended it to do. A century of silence feels permanent. But geology has little respect for human calendars. A volcano that sleeps for 100 years is not necessarily old. It may simply be resting. Long before European explorers reached the Pacific Northwest, indigenous peoples understood this better than anyone. For thousands of years, native communities, including the Cowlitz, Yakima, Klickitat, and other tribes, lived around these mountains. Their oral traditions preserved stories of fire, smoke, earthquakes, and battles between powerful mountain spirits. To later generations, some of these stories sounded like myths. But modern researchers have recognized that many oral histories may preserve memories of ancient volcanic eruptions witnessed centuries before written records existed. One famous tradition tells of two great mountains competing for the affection of another peak across the Columbia River, their battles shaking the earth and filling the skies with fire. While these stories carry spiritual meaning that goes far beyond geology, they also reflect a cultural memory of a landscape that was never truly still. The mountains had always been alive. Later settlers viewed the same peaks through different eyes. By the 19th century, The Pacific Northwest had become a land of opportunity. Vast forests supplied seemingly endless timber. Rivers powered mills. Railroads opened remote regions. Logging camps expanded deeper into the wilderness each year. Around Mount St. Helens, timber became king. Towering Douglas firs, western hemlocks, and red cedars grew to astonishing sizes. Some trees had stood for 500 years before the first logger ever marked them for harvest. Their straight trunks made ideal lumber for homes, bridges, ships, and factories across America. Entire communities depended on the forest. Every morning, logging trucks rumbled along mountain roads carrying enormous logs toward nearby mills. Small towns thrived because of the mountain rather than despite it. Grocery stores, diners, gas stations, equipment suppliers, and family businesses all relied on the steady rhythm of the timber industry. The mountain itself became part of the economy, not because it erupted, because it didn't. Its stable appearance encouraged investment. People built roads, cabins, campgrounds, lodges, marinas. The mountain became both a workplace and a playground. One of the most beloved destinations was Spirit Lake. Nestled against the northern flank of Mount St. Helens, the lake seemed almost magical. On calm mornings, the volcano reflected perfectly across its surface, creating one of the most photographed landscapes in Washington state. Families rented boats, children swam during warm summers, and vacationers gathered around evening campfires beneath skies filled with stars. There was something deeply reassuring about the place. Even the name, Spirit Lake, suggested tranquility rather than danger. Nearby stood lodges where visitors escaped city life for quiet weekends surrounded by nature. Hunters explored the forests during autumn. Snowmobilers arrived when winter blanketed the landscape. Tourism and logging existed side by side. Both depended on the mountain remaining exactly as it appeared. Yet beneath everyone's feet, another timetable was unfolding. Scientists studying layers of volcanic ash had already discovered that Mount St. Helens possessed a surprisingly active past. Unlike older volcanoes whose eruptions had become extremely infrequent, Mount St. Helens had produced dozens of significant eruptions over the past 4,000 years. In geological terms, it was among the most active volcanoes in the entire Cascade Range. It had repeatedly built lava domes, collapsed them, sent ash high into the atmosphere, generated destructive mud flows that raced through river valleys, created explosions that reshaped its slopes. The mountain had spent thousands of years reinventing itself. Its last significant eruption had occurred in the mid-1800s, before Washington had even become a state. Ash reportedly fell across parts of the Pacific Northwest, but the region was sparsely populated. Few written records survived, and those that did often came from traders, missionaries, or explorers rather than scientific observers. By the 20th century, those eruptions had faded from public memory. An entire nation had grown up believing the mountain was quiet, not because scientists claimed it was extinct, but because daily life encouraged that assumption. This reveals an interesting truth about human psychology. We rarely fear what has remained peaceful throughout our own lifetimes. A floodplain becomes an attractive place to build homes after decades without flooding. Coastal communities flourish despite hurricanes. Cities expand along earthquake faults. And people happily picnic beneath volcanoes that have slept for generations. The absence of disaster slowly convinces us that disaster belongs only to history. During the decades after World War II, America's economy boomed and outdoor recreation became more popular than ever. Families had automobiles, paid vacations, and disposable income. National parks filled with visitors. Campgrounds expanded. The Pacific Northwest marketed itself as a paradise of forests, lakes, mountains, and fresh air. Mount St. Helens fit perfectly into that vision. The mountain represented everything Americans loved about wilderness: accessible enough for a weekend trip, wild enough to feel adventurous, beautiful enough to inspire awe. Photographers often waited patiently for clouds to clear, revealing the mountain's nearly flawless cone against brilliant blue skies. Local calendars featured it. Travel brochures highlighted it. Artists painted it in every season, from snow-covered winters to vibrant autumn forests glowing beneath its summit. Few subjects sold the romance of the Pacific Northwest better. Ironically, that perfect shape should have been a clue. Volcanoes with steep, symmetrical cones are often built by repeated eruptions that pile layer upon layer of lava, ash, and volcanic debris. Every eruption helps construct the mountain while also setting the stage for future instability. Its beauty was, in many ways, the product of its violence. But almost nobody thought about that. The mountain's peaceful appearance had become more convincing than its geological history. Even many scientists believe that if Mount St. Helens erupted again, it would probably behave much like other volcanoes they had studied: a relatively vertical explosion from the summit, accompanied by falling ash and lava flows that could be monitored and, to some extent, anticipated. Almost no one imagined that the mountain itself might fail, that an entire side of the volcano could collapse, that the greatest danger might not come from above, but from the side. Nature was quietly preparing a surprise unlike anything recorded in modern American history. And although no one knew it yet, the first unmistakable warning was only weeks away. The mountain that generations had loved, photographed, logged, climbed, and admired was about to remind America that beneath every peaceful landscape lies a story written over millions of years. Sometimes those stories remain silent, and sometimes they begin to speak again. For more than a century, Mount St. Helens had remained quiet enough that most people rarely gave it a second thought. Winter snow came and went. Spring wildflowers returned to the meadows. Loggers cut timber. Campers filled the forests every summer. Children skipped stones across Spirit Lake while parents unpacked picnic baskets beneath towering evergreens. The mountain had become part of the background of everyday life. Then, without warning, everything changed. It began on the afternoon of March 15, 1980, deep beneath the volcano. Rock suddenly cracked under immense pressure. A small earthquake rippled through the mountain. By itself, it wasn't remarkable. Washington State experiences minor earthquakes every year. Most are too small to cause damage, and many pass unnoticed. Local residents hardly paid attention. But the earth wasn't finished. Over the next 2 days, the mountain shuddered again and again. The earthquakes kept coming. On March 20, at 3:47 in the afternoon, a much stronger earthquake struck. It measured magnitude 4.2. Windows rattled. Objects shook on shelves. People across southwest Washington felt the ground move beneath their feet. Unlike the earlier tremors, this one could not be ignored. It was the strongest earthquake ever instrumentally recorded directly beneath Mount St. Helens. For geologists, it was an unmistakable signal. Something underground had awakened. Within hours, seismic stations began recording dozens of additional earthquakes, then hundreds. Soon, the instruments barely had time to stop recording one tremor before another appeared. The volcano had entered an earthquake swarm. Unlike a single earthquake followed by aftershocks, an earthquake swarm is a sustained series of quakes occurring within the same area over days or weeks. It often suggests that something underground is actively moving. In this case, that something was magma. Miles beneath the mountain, molten rock was forcing its way upward through cracks in the Earth's crust. Every time it pushed against solid rock, the surrounding stone fractured, releasing another earthquake. The mountain was groaning under pressure. At first, only scientists fully appreciated the significance. The United States Geological Survey, better known as the USGS, quickly dispatched volcanologists to Mount St. Helens. Many of them had spent years studying volcanoes in Alaska, Hawaii, and overseas. Yet this situation felt different. The continental United States had not experienced a major volcanic crisis in living memory. There was no established playbook. No one knew how long the unrest might last. Some wondered whether the volcano would simply calm down after releasing pressure. Others feared something much larger. Among the scientists arriving at the mountain was a new generation of volcanologists eager to understand one of nature's greatest mysteries. They hauled seismographs, surveying equipment, radios, cameras, and notebooks up rough mountain roads. Temporary observation posts sprang up around the volcano. Every vibration mattered. Every new crack mattered. Every measurement might reveal what the mountain intended to do next. Meanwhile, local newspapers began covering the strange events. Headlines spoke of earthquakes beneath Mount St. Helens. Radio stations interrupted regular programming with updates. Television crews drove toward the volcano. Residents watched the reports with curiosity. Few watched them with fear. After all, earthquakes had happened before. Nothing dramatic had followed. Why should this be any different? Then came March 27. At precisely 12:36 in the afternoon, the mountain answered that question. Without warning, a powerful explosion burst from the summit. A towering column of steam and ash shot thousands of feet into the sky. Dark gray clouds rose above the crater before drifting eastward with the wind. Chunks of rock rained back onto the snow-covered slopes. The explosion lasted only minutes, but when it ended, Mount St. Helens no longer looked the same. A crater nearly 250 feet wide had appeared near the summit. For the first time in more than a century, the volcano was visibly erupting. Television cameras captured dramatic images. Helicopters circled overhead. The nation watched. To many viewers, it looked almost exciting. Smoke pouring from a snow-covered volcano resembled scenes from adventure movies. Some newspapers even described it as a spectacular tourist attraction. The danger still felt distant. In fact, visitor numbers increased. People drove from Seattle, Portland, and neighboring states hoping to witness the eruption themselves. Hotels filled. Restaurants welcomed extra customers. Gas stations sold out of fuel. Souvenir shops did brisk business. The mountain had become a celebrity. That response puzzled many scientists. They understood that the volcano was becoming increasingly unstable, yet crowds continued gathering nearby with cameras instead of emergency supplies. One reason was simple. The explosion seemed relatively small. Instead of rivers of lava pouring down the slopes, Mount St. Helens was producing bursts of steam. These were known as phreatic explosions. Groundwater trapped beneath the surface encountered intensely hot rock. The water instantly flashed into steam. Pressure built rapidly. Eventually, the steam blasted through weakened rock, throwing ash and debris into the air. Importantly, these early explosions did not necessarily involve fresh magma reaching the surface. To casual observers, that distinction meant little. But for volcanologists, it made forecasting much more difficult. Were these merely steam explosions relieving pressure, or were they the opening act before something much larger? No one knew. Each day brought new puzzles. Fresh explosions enlarged the crater. Ash coated nearby snowfields. Thousands of additional earthquakes rattled the volcano. Scientists worked around the clock, comparing measurements and debating possible outcomes. Some believed the volcano might continue producing relatively modest steam blasts for weeks or months. Others worried that magma was steadily rising and that a much more dangerous eruption could occur. Healthy scientific disagreement is normal during an unfolding crisis. Science advances by questioning assumptions, but during emergencies, uncertainty can be frustrating. Government officials wanted clear answers. Residents wanted reassurance. Journalists wanted predictions. Nature offered none. As March turned into April, another strange development captured everyone's attention. The northern side of Mount St. Helens began changing shape. At first, the movement was subtle. Survey instruments detected slight outward expansion. Then the deformation accelerated. Entire sections of the mountain were slowly bulging outward, day after day. Scientists installed precise distance measuring equipment. The results astonished them. Parts of the volcano's north flank were moving outward by as much as 5 feet every day. Imagine watching the side of a mountain grow before your eyes. It seemed almost impossible. Yet repeated measurements confirmed the same extraordinary result. Magma wasn't simply rising vertically, it was pushing directly against the mountain's northern wall, inflating it like an enormous blister. One volcanologist famously compared it to a growing pimple. The comparison sounded almost humorous. The reality was anything but. Inside the mountain, unimaginable pressure continued building. Yet outside the scientific community, opinions varied wildly. Many local residents trusted the experts and voluntarily stayed away. Others became skeptical. After several weeks, without a catastrophic eruption, some began asking whether officials were overreacting. Businesses near the volcano suffered as roads closed, campgrounds emptied, logging operations paused inside newly established hazard zones. For workers paid by the hour, every closure meant lost income. Economic pressure began competing with geological reality. Some logging companies requested greater access to restricted areas. Property owners wanted permission to return to cabins. Tourism operators worried that an entire season might disappear. County officials found themselves balancing public safety against mounting frustration from constituents. It was an extraordinarily difficult position. Close too much land, and communities suffered financially. Close too little, and lives might be lost. No one wanted to be responsible for either outcome. The media, meanwhile, transformed Mount St. Helens into one of America's biggest stories. Television anchors stood before smoking craters. Newspapers published daily eruption updates. Photographers captured dramatic ash plumes rising against blue skies. Some reports accurately emphasized the uncertainty. Others unintentionally encouraged thrill seekers. The volcano became a spectacle. People collected volcanic ash as souvenirs. Families parked along highways hoping for better views. Pilots flew sightseeing trips. Amateur photographers searched for the perfect shot. Human curiosity is powerful. Sometimes it pulls people closer to danger instead of farther away. Among those watching events closely was a young USG's volcanologist named David Johnston. Only 30 years old, Johnston had quickly earned respect for his careful observations and calm professionalism. Unlike the sensational headlines appearing across the country, Johnston understood how much remained unknown. He and his colleagues monitored earthquakes, measured deformation, collected rock samples, and constantly reassessed the growing hazard. They knew forecasting volcanoes was not like forecasting weather. There were no decades of modern data, no computer models capable of accurately simulating every possibility. Every new observation forced scientists to revise earlier assumptions. And yet, despite the uncertainty, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. The mountain was not calming down. It was becoming more dangerous. Every earthquake suggested continuing movement underground. Every steam explosion weakened the summit. Every measurement showed the north flank bulging farther outward. Still, predicting exactly when or how the volcano would erupt remained frustratingly beyond reach. That uncertainty created one of the greatest challenges in disaster management. People naturally seek certainty. When experts say, "We don't know exactly what will happen," many hear weakness instead of honesty. Some interpret uncertainty as evidence that the threat has been exaggerated. Others assume that if disaster hasn't happened yet, it probably won't. History has shown this pattern repeatedly. Warnings lose their urgency when they stretch over days or weeks. People become accustomed to living alongside risk. The extraordinary slowly becomes routine. Morning news reports about earthquakes beneath Mount St. Helens became as familiar as weather forecasts. Smoke rising from the crater became yesterday's news. The volcano had been restless for weeks. Life, many believed, would simply continue. But beneath the mountain, molten rock cared nothing for headlines, business schedules, or human patience. Pressure continued to build. The giant blister on the north side kept growing. And with every passing day, Mount St. Helens moved one step closer to revealing that the greatest danger was not the steam everyone could see. It was the invisible force silently reshaping the mountain from within. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your shoulders soften and allow your breathing to become slow and steady. Imagine the cool mountain air drifting gently through towering pine trees as evening settles over the quiet forests of the Pacific Northwest. The restless volcano can wait for a little while. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. Simply listen to the story as it unfolds, and if your eyelids begin to feel heavy, let them close. Rest peacefully, and let sleep find you as naturally as the morning mist settling over Spirit Lake. By the beginning of April 1980, Mount St. Helens had become two very different places. To scientists, it was one of the most closely watched volcanoes on Earth. To many local residents, it was becoming an exhausting inconvenience. Every morning began with another report of earthquakes, another burst of steam, another plume of ash drifting into the Washington sky. Television news crews broadcast live updates almost daily. Helicopters buzzed overhead, roadblocks appeared and disappeared, new hazard maps were printed, revised, and printed again. The volcano dominated every conversation. Yet despite all the attention, life had not ended. The mountain was still standing. Homes were still intact. Roads outside the restricted zones remained open. The forests were still green. As week after week passed without the catastrophic eruption many feared, something curious began to happen. People started getting used to the danger. It is one of the oldest patterns in human history. The longer a threat remains without producing disaster, the easier it becomes to believe the worst will never happen. Psychologists today call this normalcy bias, our tendency to assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday, even when evidence suggests otherwise. The people living around Mount St. Helens weren't reckless. They were human. Most had spent their entire lives in these valleys. Their parents had lived there. Their grandparents had worked the forests before them. They had celebrated birthdays beneath these mountains, hunted deer in the autumn woods, fished the rivers every spring, and watched countless winters blanket the volcano with snow. The mountain had always been part of life, not death. That deep familiarity made it incredibly difficult to imagine the landscape changing overnight. Meanwhile, scientists were watching something that defied belief. Every few days, survey teams climbed observation points carrying electronic distance measuring instruments. They carefully aimed lasers and reflectors at fixed points on the volcano, comparing measurements with previous days. At first, they assumed their equipment must be malfunctioning. The numbers seemed impossible. The northern side of the mountain wasn't merely swelling, it was moving by several feet every single day. One section of the volcano was bulging outward at a rate of nearly 5 feet every 24 hours. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the wall of your house had moved several feet overnight. That is how astonishing these measurements appeared. The mountain itself seemed to be breathing, only this breath never relaxed. Each day the bulge became larger. Each day the pressure inside the volcano increased. Scientists eventually estimated that the growing deformation stretched well over a mile across the north face. To anyone standing nearby, however, the changes were surprisingly subtle. The mountain still looked like a mountain. No gigantic cracks suddenly split the slopes. No rivers of lava poured downhill. Nature was changing the volcano on a scale that instruments detected more clearly than human eyes. Deep underground, magma continued forcing its way upward. But instead of rising straight toward the summit, it encountered layers of older, stronger rock. Unable to escape vertically, the molten rock pressed sideways against the volcano's northern flank. Imagine inflating a balloon inside a rigid box. Eventually, something must give. That hidden process worried volcanologists more than the visible steam explosions. Every measurement suggested the mountain was becoming structurally unstable. The troubling question was no longer if pressure existed. It was how long the mountain could contain it. As scientific concern increased, government officials faced an almost impossible challenge. How do you protect people from an event that no one can accurately predict? Closing the entire region indefinitely wasn't realistic. Thousands of people depended on the forests for their livelihoods. Logging companies had contracts to fulfill. Truck drivers needed work. Mill workers depended on regular deliveries of timber. Tourist businesses relied on the approaching summer season. Every additional restriction carried real economic consequences. The Pacific Northwest had long been built on timber. The forests surrounding Mount St. Helens weren't simply beautiful, they were immensely valuable. Towering Douglas firs represented decades, sometimes centuries of growth. Each harvested tree became lumber for homes, schools, bridges, furniture, and businesses throughout America. Entire towns existed because those forests existed. Every day logging stopped. Workers lost income. Small businesses lost customers. Communities worried about paying mortgages and keeping grocery stores open. Some residents began asking difficult questions. Were officials being overly cautious? Had scientists become too alarmist? Could life simply continue while the volcano released steam? These weren't unreasonable questions. They reflected the tension between public safety and economic survival, a dilemma governments still face whenever natural disasters threaten populated areas. To reduce risk while allowing some economic activity, authorities established hazard zones surrounding the volcano. These zones changed repeatedly as conditions evolved. Some areas became completely off-limits. Others allowed limited daytime access. Roadblocks were staffed by law enforcement officers and National Guard personnel. Permits became increasingly important. For many residents, these restrictions felt deeply personal. Cabins that had belonged to families for generations suddenly became inaccessible. Hunters couldn't reach favorite trails. Property owners found themselves asking permission to visit land they legally owned. Some accepted the inconvenience, others grew increasingly frustrated. Few individuals captured that frustration more vividly than one man whose name would become inseparable from the story of Mount St. Helens, Harry R. Truman, not the former president. This Harry Truman was an 83-year-old lodge owner who had spent decades living beside Spirit Lake, colorful, outspoken, stubborn, and fiercely independent. Truman had become something of a local legend long before the volcano awakened. His Spirit Lake Lodge welcomed fishermen, vacationers, hunters, and travelers seeking peace in the mountains. He knew the lake better than almost anyone alive. He loved it deeply. When officials urged residents inside the danger zone to evacuate, Harry Truman refused. Repeatedly, reporters soon discovered him. Television cameras loved his interviews. Smoking a cigarette, often accompanied by his 16 beloved cats, Truman spoke with the confidence of someone who believed experience mattered more than scientific models. He insisted the mountain knew him. He wasn't afraid. If the mountain goes, he famously suggested in different interviews, "I'm going with it." To many Americans watching from their living rooms, Harry Truman became a folk hero. He represented rugged independence, self-reliance, the frontier spirit. His defiance made for compelling television. But volcanologists saw something different. They saw a man placing enormous faith in familiarity. Harry Truman had lived beside Mount St. Helens for more than 50 years. Because it had never seriously threatened him before, he found it almost impossible to believe it would now. His story reflected the psychology of countless others. When danger becomes part of everyday life, extraordinary warnings can begin to sound ordinary. Scientists, meanwhile, were living under constant pressure. One of the most dedicated among them was David A. Johnston. Only 30 years old, Johnston possessed both remarkable intelligence and remarkable humility. Unlike the dramatic headlines appearing in newspapers, Johnston spent long days quietly gathering data. He understood that every measurement mattered, every earthquake, every gas sample, every survey. Volcanoes do not reveal their intentions easily. Johnston and his colleagues worked in difficult conditions. They hiked rough terrain carrying heavy equipment. Ash coated their instruments. Weather frequently changed without warning. Communication remained challenging in remote mountain terrain. Yet despite the hardships, they recognized they were witnessing something historically significant. No modern American volcanologist had ever studied an eruption like this in real time. Every observation expanded scientific understanding. Still, knowledge had limits. One evening, scientists might believe pressure was decreasing. The next morning, fresh measurements would contradict that assumption. New steam explosions repeatedly altered the summit. Ash continued drifting across nearby communities. Earthquakes refused to stop. The volcano seemed determined to remain unpredictable. Outside the scientific camps, curiosity continued attracting visitors. Although major access roads were closed, countless people searched for places to glimpse the mountain. Some parked miles away with binoculars. Others climbed nearby hills. Photographers competed for dramatic images. Television crews waited patiently for the next explosion. The volcano had become America's biggest outdoor spectacle. Few people fully appreciated how unusual the situation really was. Most volcanoes that capture public attention erupt with lava fountains or glowing rivers of molten rock. Mount St. Helens looked different. It often appeared almost harmless. Steam drifted gently upward. Snow remained on much of the mountain. Birds still flew overhead. Forests remained standing. Nothing about the landscape suggested that one of the most violent volcanic events in American history was only weeks away. Nature was disguising its intentions remarkably well. As April turned into May, the giant bulge on the mountain's north side continued expanding. Scientists estimated that hundreds of millions of cubic yards of rock were slowly being pushed outward. The volcano had become increasingly unstable. Some researchers worried privately about the possibility of a landslide. Others believed the summit might simply erupt vertically before structural failure occurred. No historical example perfectly matched what they were observing. Forecasting remained extraordinarily difficult. The uncertainty frustrated everyone. Government officials wanted a timetable. Residents wanted reassurance. Journalists wanted predictions. Scientists could offer only probabilities. They knew the volcano was dangerous. They knew pressure was increasing. They knew the mountain was changing every day. But they could not tell anyone whether disaster would arrive tomorrow or months later. This uncertainty slowly reshaped human behavior. Some residents became even more cautious. Others became increasingly confident. After all, the mountain had been active for nearly 2 months. Nothing catastrophic had happened. Perhaps the scientists had been overly concerned. Perhaps the steam explosions had released enough pressure. Perhaps the crisis was already ending. History repeatedly teaches the same painful lesson. The period immediately before disaster often feels strangely ordinary. People still drink coffee before work. Children still laugh. Newspapers still arrive on front porches. Life continues almost normally. And then, without warning, the ordinary world disappears. During the second week of May, Mount St. Helens looked almost peaceful again. The dramatic steam explosions became less frequent. Some observers interpreted the quieter appearance as encouraging news, but inside the volcano, silence did not mean safety. The pressure had not vanished. It had merely become invisible. Beneath millions of tons of rock, molten magma continued pushing relentlessly against the mountain's weakening northern flank. The giant blister continued growing. The forests below remained unaware. Spirit Lake reflected the volcano as beautifully as ever. Loggers waited impatiently for access. Scientists checked their instruments once again. And somewhere deep beneath the snow-covered summit, forces that had been building for thousands of years were approaching their breaking point. The mountain everyone thought they understood was about to reveal that it had been preparing a completely different ending all along. Sunday, May 18, 1980, began like countless other spring mornings in the Pacific Northwest. The air was cool, the sky was mostly clear. Fresh snow still clung to the upper slopes of Mount St. Helens, glowing softly beneath the first rays of sunlight. The forests below were waking to another peaceful day. Birds called across the valleys. Deer wandered through the trees. Spirit Lake reflected the mountain with the same quiet beauty that had captivated generations. Nothing about the scene suggested that within the next few minutes, one of the greatest natural disasters in modern American history would unfold. It was just after 8:30 in the morning. Some campers were preparing breakfast. Loggers were thinking about another day's work. Scientists had already begun checking instruments from observation posts surrounding the volcano. Photographers waited hopefully for another plume of steam. Many people believed they would simply witness another routine day of volcanic activity. They were wrong. At precisely 8:32 a.m., the mountain made its decision. Deep beneath Mount St. Helens, accumulated stress finally overcame the strength of solid rock. A magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck directly beneath the volcano. By itself, it was not the largest earthquake Washington had ever experienced. But where it occurred and what happened next changed everything. For nearly 2 months, magma had been pushing relentlessly against the mountain's northern flank, inflating the enormous bulge scientists had measured day after day. The earthquake was the final trigger. Within seconds, gravity took over. The entire northern side of Mount St. Helens began collapsing. Not gradually, not over hours, almost instantly. Imagine removing the front wall of a dam holding back unimaginable pressure. That is essentially what happened. The bulging face of the volcano, already weakened from weeks of deformation, broke apart into countless enormous blocks of rock. The mountain itself began sliding downhill. This was not simply a landslide. It was the largest landslide ever recorded in human history. Nearly 3 billion cubic yards of rock, ice, snow, and earth thundered down the northern slope at astonishing speed. Entire hillsides disappeared. Ridges that had existed for thousands of years were swept away in moments. The collapsing mountain accelerated toward the valleys below, reaching speeds of well over 100 miles per hour. The ground shook violently. Dust filled the air. The landscape literally began to vanish. For the scientists watching from observation posts, there was almost no time to understand what they were seeing. David Johnston was stationed approximately 5.5 miles northwest of the summit at a location known as Coldwater 2. For weeks, he had carefully monitored the growing bulge. He knew the mountain was dangerous, but even he could not fully anticipate what was now unfolding before his eyes. As the north face collapsed, Johnston immediately realized something extraordinary had begun. He grabbed his radio. His calm voice transmitted what would become one of the most famous messages in the history of volcanology. Vancouver. Vancouver. This is it. Those 4 words were enough. They communicated everything. The eruption everyone feared had begun. Moments later, Johnston's observation post disappeared beneath the advancing blast. He was only 30 years old. His final radio transmission has since become a lasting symbol of scientific dedication, a reminder of the extraordinary risks researchers sometimes accept to protect others. But the collapsing mountainside was only the beginning. Hidden beneath that enormous mass of rock lay something even more terrifying. For weeks, magma had been trapped under immense pressure. The northern flank of the volcano had acted like the cork sealing an enormous bottle. When the landslide removed that cork, the pressure escaped instantly. The eruption that followed defied almost every expectation. Instead of exploding upward first, Mount St. Helens exploded sideways. A lateral blast burst through the collapsed northern face with unimaginable force. Superheated gases, volcanic ash, pulverized rock, steam, everything erupted horizontally across the landscape. The blast raced northward at speeds estimated between 300 and 670 miles per hour. Its temperature exceeded 500 degrees Fahrenheit in many areas. Trees that had stood for centuries never had a chance. The blast front slammed into forests with the force of a hurricane multiplied many times over. Millions of trees snapped like pencils. Some were stripped entirely of branches. Others were uprooted and thrown enormous distances. Entire forests simply ceased to exist. From the air, the devastation would later resemble giant rows of fallen matchsticks, all pointing away from the volcano. The pattern revealed the incredible direction and power of the explosion. Wildlife suffered the same fate. Elk, black bears, mountain lions, birds, countless smaller animals. Many perished instantly. Others survived only because they happened to be sheltered behind ridges, buried underground, or hidden beneath lingering snow. Nature's destruction was vast. Nature's survival would prove equally remarkable. But that story belonged to another day. At the moment of eruption, chaos spread faster than anyone could communicate. The lateral blast continued racing across the landscape. Within minutes, it had devastated approximately 230 square miles of forest. The force flattened everything in its path. Roads disappeared beneath fallen timber. Bridges collapsed. Power lines vanished. Cabins exploded from the pressure wave. Vehicles were tossed aside like toys. Some people survived only because they happened to be shielded by hills or valleys that diverted the blast overhead. A difference of only a few hundred yards often separated life from death. Meanwhile, the volcano itself continued evolving. Once the north flank had collapsed and the lateral blast escaped, Mount St. Helens finally produced the towering eruption column many scientists had originally expected. Ash shot nearly 15 miles into the atmosphere. Lightning flashed repeatedly inside the growing volcanic cloud. The column rose with astonishing speed before spreading outward like an enormous gray umbrella across the sky. From dozens of miles away, people looked upward in disbelief. Some initially thought they were witnessing a massive thunderstorm. Others believed a nuclear explosion had occurred. The eruption looked unlike anything most Americans had ever seen. The ash cloud continued climbing. Wind currents soon began carrying millions of tons of volcanic ash eastward across Washington. Morning became twilight. Then darkness. Communities hundreds of miles away watched daylight disappear beneath falling ash. Streetlights switched on in the middle of the day. Drivers slowed almost to a stop because visibility dropped to only a few feet. Fine volcanic particles entered engines, clogged air filters, coated crops, and covered rooftops. Children looked out classroom windows as the sky turned black. The eruption had become a national event. Back near the volcano, another deadly force was forming: pyroclastic flows. The name sounds technical. The reality was horrifying. These were avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic debris rushing down the mountain at tremendous speed. Unlike lava, which often moves slowly enough to avoid, pyroclastic flows can outrun vehicles. Their temperatures can exceed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything in their path is incinerated. Everything. Several pyroclastic flows swept through the newly formed crater, filling valleys with smoking volcanic debris. Snow and glaciers melted instantly. The sudden release of water mixed with ash and loose sediment to create lahars, massive volcanic mudflows. These rivers of mud surged into nearby river valleys. They destroyed bridges, swept away roads, damaged homes, carried enormous logs downstream like floating toothpicks. The eruption had become not one disaster, but many disasters happening simultaneously: landslide, blast, ashfall, pyroclastic flows, mud flows, flooding. Each threatened different areas. Each created different challenges. Emergency responders struggled to understand what was happening because communication collapsed almost immediately. Telephone lines failed. Roads vanished. Observation posts disappeared. Aircraft initially could not safely approach because of dense ash. Information arrived slowly and often incompletely. Officials knew something catastrophic had occurred. They simply didn't yet know how catastrophic. Throughout the morning, radio stations interrupted regular programming. Television networks cut into broadcasts. Reports remained confused. One announcer spoke of a major eruption. Another mentioned destroyed forests. Rumors spread rapidly. Entire towns, some claimed, had been wiped off the map. No one could immediately verify the extent of the devastation. Families desperately tried contacting loved ones. Many couldn't. Road closures complicated every rescue effort. Helicopter crews flew through dangerous conditions searching for survivors. Pilots later described the landscape as almost unrecognizable. Familiar landmarks had vanished. Entire ridges no longer existed. Spirit Lake had transformed beyond recognition. The landslide had dumped unimaginable quantities of debris into the lake, displacing enormous volumes of water. A gigantic wave swept across its surface. Millions of fallen trees floated together in an immense tangled raft. Even today, many of those logs continue floating on Spirit Lake, silent reminders of that extraordinary morning. One of the most astonishing aspects of the eruption was how quickly everything happened. From the earthquake that triggered the collapse to the devastating lateral blast, only seconds passed. Within minutes, the landscape of southwestern Washington had been permanently rewritten. No emergency evacuation could have begun after the collapse. No warning sirens could have outrun the blast. For everyone inside the direct path, decisions made days earlier, not seconds earlier, determined survival. That fact would profoundly influence future disaster planning across America. The eruption ultimately claimed 57 lives. Considering the scale of destruction, that number remains surprisingly low. Scientists have long believed that the extensive evacuation zones established before May 18 prevented what could easily have become hundreds or even thousands of deaths. Many people who criticized the restrictions during April quietly recognized afterward that those unpopular decisions had saved countless lives. Nature had demonstrated a painful truth. Preparing for disasters often feels excessive until the disaster actually arrives. As rescue operations continued, another realization slowly emerged. Scientists had misunderstood one critical aspect of the volcano. Most hazard planning had assumed a relatively vertical eruption. Few expected an enormous lateral explosion powerful enough to flatten forests nearly 20 miles from the summit. Mount St. Helens had rewritten the textbooks. Volcanologists around the world suddenly recognized that volcanoes could fail in ways previously considered extremely unlikely. The eruption became one of the most carefully studied natural disasters in history. Every photograph, every seismic record, every eyewitness account, every fallen tree, each became part of an enormous scientific investigation that continues even today. But on that Sunday morning, none of those future discoveries mattered to the people desperately searching for family members, friends, and colleagues. For them, the mountain that had always represented beauty had become almost unrecognizable. Its elegant summit was gone. Nearly 1,300 feet of the peak had been blasted away. In its place stood a vast horseshoe-shaped crater open toward the north. The mountain itself had lost part of its identity. So had America. Because for the first time in generations, millions of Americans were reminded that even in a nation connected by highways, satellites, and modern science, there are moments when the earth still possesses the power to humble every prediction. The forests had fallen, the sky had turned black, the mountain had forever changed its face. And as the ash continued drifting east across the continent, the full human cost of that extraordinary morning was only beginning to emerge. But for now, let the roaring mountain grow quiet once again. Imagine the ash settling gently over distant forests as the wind slowly fades. There is no rush here, no task waiting for you. Allow your breathing to become slow and even, like the calm waters that would one day return to these valleys. Let your shoulders relax. Let your thoughts drift like soft clouds across the evening sky. And if sleep is beginning to find you, welcome it. The story will still be here when you awaken. When the eruption finally ended, an eerie silence settled over the landscape. The deafening explosions were gone. The ground had stopped shaking. The towering ash column continued drifting high above the Pacific Northwest, but below it there was almost no sound at all. Entire forests had disappeared. The familiar songs of birds had been replaced by an unsettling stillness. The mountain that had once echoed with the sounds of flowing streams, chainsaws, campers, and wildlife now resembled another planet. No one immediately knew how many people had survived. No one knew exactly where the blast had reached, and no one could safely enter the heart of the destruction. From miles away, helicopters began circling cautiously around the volcano. The pilots had expected damage. What they saw instead left many of them speechless. The landscape they knew had vanished. Mount St. Helens itself looked almost unrecognizable. The graceful cone that had dominated postcards for generations had been ripped open like a broken shell. The northern summit simply wasn't there anymore. In its place was a gigantic crater nearly 2 miles wide, its jagged walls still releasing steam and ash. But the mountain wasn't the only thing transformed. Everything north of it seemed erased. Dense evergreen forests had become vast gray plains covered with shattered timber. Hills that pilots had used as navigation landmarks were missing. Roads disappeared beneath fallen trees and thick volcanic debris. Rivers had carved completely new paths through valleys that no longer resembled the maps printed only days before. One helicopter pilot later described the view as flying over a world that had been turned inside out. That description wasn't an exaggeration. The eruption had rearranged the landscape itself. Among the first priorities was locating the scientists who had been monitoring the volcano. For weeks, they had occupied observation posts surrounding Mount St. Helens, carefully recording every earthquake, every plume of steam, and every change in the mountain's shape. Some observation sites lay outside the most dangerous zone. Others had been directly in the path of the lateral blast. None drew more attention than Coldwater 2. That was where David A. Johnston had made his final radio call. Rescue teams desperately hoped he had somehow escaped. Perhaps he had reached shelter. Perhaps the radio transmission had come just before evacuation. Perhaps, but as helicopters searched the devastated landscape, hope steadily faded. The blast had swept across Johnston's observation point with unimaginable speed and force. Nothing recognizable remained. David Johnston became one of the eruption's 57 confirmed victims. His death deeply affected the scientific community. He had been only 30 years old. Brilliant, curious, dedicated, friends remembered not only his intelligence, but also his enthusiasm. Johnston believed that understanding volcanoes could save lives. During the weeks leading up to the eruption, he had worked tirelessly despite long hours, harsh weather, and enormous uncertainty. His final message, Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it, has echoed through the decades not because it was dramatic, but because it reflected complete professionalism. Even in the final seconds of his life, his first instinct was to warn others. Today, visitors to Mount St. Helens can still find the Johnston Ridge Observatory named in his honor. It stands as a reminder that scientific knowledge is often earned through extraordinary dedication and sometimes extraordinary sacrifice. Johnston was not the only scientist whose life was forever changed. Many members of the USG's team survived only because they happened to be positioned outside the blast zone that morning. Several later admitted they had struggled with survivor's guilt. Why had they lived while colleagues had not? Could different decisions have saved more lives? Those questions lingered long after the ash had settled. The search soon expanded beyond scientists. Rescue crews looked for campers, hunters, loggers, photographers, vacationers, anyone who might have been inside the restricted areas. Many had obeyed evacuation orders, some had not. The challenge facing search teams was unlike anything they had experienced before. There were no recognizable neighborhoods to search, no standing buildings, no familiar landmarks. The blast had covered everything with ash, broken timber, and volcanic debris. Even helicopters found navigation difficult because the landscape itself had changed. Search and rescue operations became a race against time. Military helicopters joined civilian aircraft, National Guard units assisted local authorities, volunteers arrived from across Washington, yet every mission carried risk. The volcano remained active, ash reduced visibility, loose volcanic deposits made landing dangerous. Fresh mud flows continued moving through valleys. Even rescuers needed rescuing at times. Among the stories that captured national attention was that of Harry R. Truman. For weeks before the eruption, the 83-year-old lodge owner had become famous for refusing to leave Spirit Lake. Journalists loved interviewing him. He joked with reporters, dismissed the danger, insisted the mountain had never harmed him before. His confidence made him a symbol of stubborn independence. Many Americans admired him. Others worried that his example might encourage others to ignore evacuation orders. When the eruption came, Harry Truman never had a chance. His lodge disappeared beneath the landslide and volcanic debris. Neither his body nor his beloved cats were ever recovered. In death, Harry Truman became something different from the colorful character viewers had watched on television. He became a reminder that nature does not negotiate. Experience, confidence, familiarity, none of them could withstand a blast moving hundreds of miles per hour. His story remains one of the most poignant lessons of Mount St. Helens. The mountain did not care how many years someone had lived beside it. As rescue crews searched for survivors, remarkable stories of survival also began emerging. One of the most extraordinary involved people who escaped not because they outran the eruption, but because geography protected them. The lateral blast did not spread evenly across the landscape. Ridges, valleys, and hills redirected parts of the devastating wave. Some locations only a short distance apart experienced completely different outcomes. A ridge only a few hundred feet high sometimes shielded those behind it from the full force of the explosion. Others found protection inside sturdy vehicles, culverts, or depressions in the landscape. Survival often depended on circumstances no one could have predicted. One family recalled hearing an explosion unlike anything imaginable before the sky suddenly turned black. Ash fell so heavily that they could not see beyond the hood of their vehicle. Breathing became difficult. Fine volcanic particles entered every opening. The air itself seemed to disappear. Many survivors later described the darkness as one of the most frightening aspects of the disaster. Even in daylight, it felt like midnight. There was no visible sun, no horizon, only ash. The eruption also transformed Spirit Lake into one of the strangest places on Earth. When the enormous landslide slammed into the northern end of the lake, it displaced an astonishing amount of water. A gigantic wave, estimated to be hundreds of feet high, surged across the lake. The water stripped hillsides bare. It snapped mature forests before carrying millions of logs back into the lake. Those floating trees eventually formed an immense log mat unlike anything previously documented. Even today, more than 4 decades later, thousands of those logs continue drifting across Spirit Lake. Scientists still study them because they provide valuable insights into ecological recovery. Nature, once again, refused to follow simple expectations. Many people assumed the blast zone would remain lifeless for generations. Looking at the destruction, that prediction seemed entirely reasonable. Almost every tree lay flattened. The ground appeared sterilized. Streams vanished beneath ash. The landscape looked incapable of supporting life. But nature had prepared surprises. Within weeks, researchers began discovering survivors in unexpected places. Pocket gophers that had remained underground escaped the intense heat. Seeds buried beneath insulating soil survived. Insects hidden beneath logs emerged. Certain amphibians living underwater weathered the catastrophe. Even some elk survived by standing behind protective ridges that blocked the blast. These discoveries fascinated biologists. Until 1980, many scientists believed complete ecological destruction required complete ecological rebuilding by humans. Mount St. Helens challenged that assumption. The blast zone became one of the largest natural laboratories in the world. Instead of immediately clearing debris and replanting every forest, researchers argued that portions of the devastated landscape should remain untouched. They wanted to observe how nature heals itself. That decision would fundamentally change ecological science. The eruption destroyed. But it also revealed resilience that few had imagined possible. Human communities faced a slower recovery. Families mourned loved ones. Search teams continued working for weeks. Some victims were never found. The official death toll eventually reached 57, but each number represented a story interrupted. A photographer chasing one last picture. A logger hoping to return to work. A lodge owner unwilling to abandon the life he loved. Scientists committed to protecting others. Vacationers expecting an ordinary Sunday morning. Each life reflected a different reason for being near the mountain. Together, they formed one of the most human chapters of the disaster. As investigators reconstructed the events leading up to May 18, one conclusion became increasingly clear. The evacuation zones had worked, not perfectly, but remarkably well. Given the scale of the eruption, experts later estimated that hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of additional people might have died had officials not imposed unpopular restrictions weeks earlier. The criticism directed at scientists and emergency managers before the eruption gradually gave way to appreciation. The difficult decisions to close roads, restrict access, and order evacuations had undoubtedly saved lives. That lesson reshaped emergency management across the United States. Sometimes the greatest success in disaster planning is invisible. When preparations work, people often forget what might have happened without them. As helicopters continued flying over the blast zone in the days that followed, another realization slowly emerged. The eruption had not simply destroyed a forest, it had transformed the relationship between Americans and the landscapes they loved. For generations, many people had viewed mountains as permanent. Stable, predictable, Mount St. Helens proved otherwise. Even the mightiest landscapes could change within minutes. Even places filled with treasured memories could become almost unrecognizable. Yet amid the devastation, something remarkable was already beginning. Tiny signs of life, a green shoot pushing through ash, an insect crawling across newly deposited volcanic rock, a bird returning to territory everyone believed had been lost forever. Nature was beginning its quiet recovery almost before humans had finished counting the losses. And while the blast zone still looked like the end of the world, it was already becoming the beginning of an entirely new story. For the people living closest to Mount St. Helens, the eruption ended almost as quickly as it began. Within minutes, entire forests had been flattened. Within hours, rescue helicopters filled the skies. Within days, attention turned toward the enormous task of recovery. But for millions of other Americans, the disaster was only beginning. The eruption was no longer confined to one mountain in Washington. The mountain was coming to them, invisible at first, carried by the wind. High above the continent, an immense column of volcanic ash climbed nearly 15 miles into the atmosphere before being caught by powerful jet stream winds. There, thousands of feet above commercial aircraft and weather systems. Billions of tiny particles began an extraordinary journey across North America. Unlike the dramatic images of exploding volcanoes shown on television, volcanic ash is not soft like fireplace ash. It is something far more dangerous. Each tiny grain is made of shattered volcanic rock and glass. Viewed under a microscope, the particles resemble countless razor-sharp fragments. They are abrasive. They scratch metal, they clog machinery, they damage engines, they irritate lungs and eyes, they infiltrate almost everything. As the winds carried the ash eastward, few people realized what was approaching. In eastern Washington, residents noticed the sky beginning to lose its familiar blue color. Sunlight became strangely muted. The horizon faded behind a growing gray haze. Then, without warning, the ash began to fall. It drifted gently at first, almost like unusually fine snow. Children reached out to catch it. Some adults stepped outside in curiosity. Within hours, curiosity gave way to concern. The ash kept falling. It settled on rooftops, covered fields, blanketed cars, collected in gutters, coated roads. Every passing vehicle stirred enormous gray clouds back into the air, making visibility increasingly difficult. Cities that had awakened beneath clear spring skies looked as though they had been buried beneath months of dust. One of the hardest-hit communities was Yakima. Located roughly 140 miles east of Mount St. Helens, residents had expected a light dusting. Instead, darkness arrived in the middle of the afternoon. Streetlights switched on. Drivers turned on headlights. Businesses closed early because customers could barely see the streets. Many residents later described the experience as surreal. The world outside their windows no longer looked familiar. People wrapped towels around doors and windows, hoping to keep the fine ash outside. It rarely worked. The particles found every tiny opening. They slipped beneath doors, through air vents, around window frames. Soon, tables, floors, and furniture inside homes carried a thin layer of volcanic dust. People quickly learned that sweeping only stirred the particles back into the air. Vacuum cleaners often failed because the abrasive ash damaged their motors. The safest approach was slow, careful cleaning with damp cloths and water. Even that became exhausting. Meanwhile, hospitals and clinics began treating patients with irritated eyes, sore throats, and breathing difficulties. For healthy adults, volcanic ash was usually more irritating than deadly. But for people with asthma, chronic lung disease, or other respiratory conditions, the air became genuinely hazardous. Officials urged residents to stay indoors whenever possible. Those who needed to venture outside were encouraged to wear masks or improvised face coverings. Hardware stores sold out of respirators almost immediately. Pharmacies struggled to meet demand. Simple paper masks became unexpectedly valuable. Perhaps the greatest challenge involved transportation. Volcanic ash and engines are a dangerous combination. Automobiles depend on clean air entering their engines. Ash clogged filters almost immediately. Many drivers unknowingly damaged their vehicles by continuing to drive through heavy deposits. Mechanics soon found themselves replacing air filters at unprecedented rates. Some engines overheated, others suffered permanent damage. Road crews worked continuously to remove ash before traffic ground it into pavement. Yet even cleanup created new problems. Sweeping machines raised enormous clouds. Water trucks turned ash into thick gray mud. Communities experimented with different techniques, learning through trial and error because few American cities had ever faced such an event. Air travel presented an even greater concern. Modern jet engines operate at incredibly high temperatures. When volcanic ash enters those engines, the particles can melt inside the combustion chamber before cooling again into glass like deposits. Those deposits may block airflow, reduce engine performance, or even cause complete engine failure. In 1980, the aviation industry was only beginning to understand this danger. Following the eruption, airports across parts of the Pacific Northwest suspended operations. Pilots received warnings to avoid ash clouds. Commercial flights were delayed or rerouted. Military aircraft also adjusted operations. The lessons learned from Mount St. Helens would later influence global aviation safety, especially after several international incidents in which passenger jets unknowingly flew through volcanic ash. Today, airlines around the world monitor volcanic eruptions with remarkable attention, a direct legacy of disasters like Mount St. Helens. Agriculture also suffered. Eastern Washington is one of America's most productive farming regions. Wheat fields stretched across rolling hills. Fruit orchards supplied apples, cherries, and pears to markets around the world. Livestock grazed across open pastures. When ash settled across farmland, farmers immediately worried about the future. Would crops survive? Would livestock become sick? Would contaminated irrigation systems fail? Fortunately, the answers proved more encouraging than many feared. Heavy ash damaged some young plants and complicated planting schedules, but volcanic ash itself is not poisonous. In fact, over long periods, volcanic material often enriches soil by adding valuable minerals. The problem wasn't toxicity, it was timing. A thick layer of ash blocked sunlight, complicated irrigation, and interfered with machinery during one of the busiest parts of the agricultural calendar. Farmers spent countless hours cleaning equipment instead of tending crops. Across the region, businesses faced equally unexpected challenges. Banks temporarily closed. Schools canceled classes. Factories struggled to operate because machinery became contaminated. Mail delivery slowed. Construction projects halted. Restaurants worked constantly to keep ash from entering kitchens. Even something as ordinary as opening a front door became frustrating. Every entrance allowed another wave of gray dust inside. The eruption's economic effects spread far beyond the immediate blast zone. Tourism collapsed almost overnight. Hotels lost reservations. Campgrounds emptied. Fishing guides canceled trips. Mountain resorts closed indefinitely. The forests that had attracted visitors from around the world were now inaccessible. Logging companies faced even greater uncertainty. Millions of valuable trees had been destroyed. Road networks vanished beneath landslides and fallen timber. Entire logging operations suddenly became impossible. For communities built around timber, the eruption represented not only a natural disaster, but also an economic one. Thousands worried about jobs. Families wondered how long recovery would take. Businesses questioned whether customers would ever return. Meanwhile, television networks broadcast extraordinary images into homes across America. Helicopters flew above flattened forests. Reporters stood in ash-covered streets wearing masks. Newspapers printed dramatic front-page photographs of the shattered mountain. For many Americans, these images challenged long-held assumptions. Volcanoes belonged in Hawaii, or distant countries, not the continental United States, not Washington State. Mount St. Helens reminded the nation that the American landscape remained every bit as dynamic as the landscapes of Japan, Indonesia, or Italy. The disaster also transformed volcanologists into familiar public figures. Scientists who had spent their careers quietly studying rocks suddenly appeared on national television explaining magma chambers, earthquake swarms, and volcanic hazards. Many viewers heard terms like pyroclastic flow and lahar for the first time. Public interest in earth science grew dramatically. Universities reported increased enrollment in geology courses. Young students watched the coverage and decided they wanted to understand how mountains could suddenly awaken. In this unexpected way, the eruption inspired an entirely new generation of scientists. Not all effects remained within American borders. Fine volcanic ash circled the globe. Atmospheric researchers tracked the eruption's plume as it gradually dispersed through the upper atmosphere. Compared with some of history's largest eruptions, Mount St. Helens did not significantly alter global climate. Events such as the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora or the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo injected far greater quantities of material into the atmosphere. Even so, scientists carefully studied Mount St. Helens because it provided modern instruments with an unprecedented opportunity. Satellites observed the ash cloud. Weather balloons sampled the atmosphere. Ground stations tracked particle movement. The eruption became one of the most intensively monitored volcanic events in history. Every observation improved understanding of how volcanic material moves through Earth's atmosphere. That knowledge would later benefit weather forecasting, aviation safety, and disaster response worldwide. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the ash cloud was its reach. Within days, traces of Mount St. Helens had crossed the United States. Eventually, fine particles completed a journey around the Earth. A single mountain in Washington had briefly connected the planet through the atmosphere. It was a humbling reminder that natural disasters rarely remain local. The eruption also revealed something deeply human. Across the country, communities sent assistance to Washington. Volunteers arrived to help with cleanup. Scientists shared expertise. Military units provided equipment. Neighbors helped neighbors clear ash from roofs before the added weight caused structural damage. People who had never visited Mount St. Helens donated money to recovery efforts. Others mailed masks, medical supplies, and equipment. In moments of disaster, Americans often rediscover an instinct for cooperation that everyday life sometimes hides. The weeks after the eruption became filled with stories not only of destruction but also of generosity. By early summer, the skies above much of the Pacific Northwest had finally begun returning to normal. Rain gradually washed ash from rooftops. Road crews cleared highways. Businesses reopened. Schools resumed classes. Children once again played outside beneath blue skies. Yet nothing looked quite the same. Every clean street reminded residents of the work required to restore it. Every repaired building carried memories of gray dust. Every conversation eventually returned to the same question. How could one mountain have changed so much so quickly? The answer lay not only in the eruption itself, but in the lessons it forced America to learn. The ash that had darkened cities also illuminated something else. Modern society, despite all its technology, remained deeply vulnerable to the forces of nature. A single volcanic eruption had disrupted transportation, commerce, agriculture, education, communication, and daily life across multiple states. The disaster exposed weaknesses few had previously imagined. It also inspired innovations that would make the nation better prepared for the future. Those lessons, however, would not come from the ash-covered streets. They would come from the long and difficult process of rebuilding a landscape that many believed had been destroyed forever. But for now, let the gray skies slowly clear in your imagination. Picture gentle rain washing the ash from the forests, leaving the air cool, fresh, and quiet once more. There is nothing you need to hurry toward. Let each slow breath carry away the dust of the day, just as the rivers carried the last traces of ash downstream. Allow your mind to become calm and still, and if sleep is beginning to settle over you, let it arrive as softly as evening mist drifting through the peaceful valleys beneath the mountain. In the days immediately following the eruption, Many people believed they were looking at a landscape that would never recover. The devastation seemed absolute. More than 230 square miles of forest had been flattened. Rivers were clogged with ash and fallen timber. Roads had vanished beneath landslides. Bridges lay twisted in muddy valleys. Spirit Lake no longer resembled the peaceful destination families remembered. The elegant summit of Mount St. Helens itself had disappeared. Standing before such destruction, it was easy to imagine that the mountain had become permanently lifeless. Some newspaper headlines even described the blast zone as a dead zone. It sounded accurate. But nature had already begun proving otherwise. The first challenge, however, belonged to people. Before anyone could think about rebuilding communities, they first had to make the area safe. Engineers arrived almost immediately. Their task was unlike any they had faced before. Maps had become unreliable because the landscape itself had changed. Entire valleys were filled with fresh volcanic debris. River channels no longer flowed where they had only weeks earlier. Bridges that once crossed rivers now stood above empty channels, while elsewhere new rivers carved paths through roads and farmland. The eruption had redrawn geography. One of the greatest concerns involved flooding. The eruption had dumped enormous amounts of ash, rock, and timber into the total river system. Water that once flowed freely now encountered natural dams created by landslides and volcanic debris. Hydrologists worried that heavy rain or rapid snowmelt could trigger catastrophic floods far downstream. Entire communities faced a new threat. The eruption itself had ended. Its consequences had not. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers soon launched one of the largest river restoration efforts in American history. Workers began dredging river channels to remove millions of cubic yards of sediment. Specialized equipment operated almost continuously. Bulldozers reshaped riverbanks. Excavators removed fallen timber. Engineers designed new systems to manage the enormous quantities of sediment still washing down from the volcano. It was exhausting work. Yet every mile of restored river reduced the risk facing downstream towns. The roads presented another enormous challenge. Highways leading toward Mount St. Helens had simply disappeared in places. Some had been buried beneath dozens of feet of volcanic mud. Others had been washed away entirely by lahars. Before tourists, scientists, or even local residents could safely return, transportation had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Construction crews worked through difficult conditions. Fresh ash damaged machinery. Unstable ground complicated surveying. Weather frequently interrupted operations. Nevertheless, one road after another slowly reopened. Each restored bridge represented more than transportation. It represented confidence. It signaled that communities intended to remain. Meanwhile, thousands of people faced deeply personal decisions. Many families had lost homes, others had lost businesses, some had lost both. Insurance claims piled up. Federal disaster assistance became essential. Banks worked with borrowers whose properties no longer existed. Local governments struggled to balance shrinking tax revenues against enormous rebuilding costs. The eruption had demonstrated something often overlooked after natural disasters. The economic damage continues long after television cameras leave. For logging communities, the situation proved especially complicated. Millions of fallen trees covered the blast zone. At first glance, they appeared to represent an extraordinary supply of timber. But harvesting them was far more difficult than it seemed. Many roads had vanished. The fallen trees lay tangled together in chaotic piles. Some remained buried beneath ash. Others had been broken into unusable fragments. Even reaching them safely required rebuilding infrastructure first. Still, Enormous salvage logging operations eventually began. Workers raced against time because dead timber gradually loses commercial value as insects, fungi, and weather began breaking it down. The operation became one of the largest salvage logging efforts in American history. Some believed recovering the timber made practical and economic sense. Others argued that the blast zone should remain largely untouched. The debate reflected two very different philosophies. One viewed the devastated forest primarily as a valuable economic resource. The other viewed it as an irreplaceable scientific opportunity. Both perspectives had merit, and both would shape the future of Mount St. Helens. Scientists strongly urged caution. To many ecologists, the eruption represented something incredibly rare. Almost nowhere else in the modern world could researchers observe an ecosystem rebuilding itself from such extensive destruction. Normally, forests recovering after fires, storms, or logging are heavily influenced by human intervention. Trees are replanted, roads are rebuilt, landscapes are managed. Mount St. Helens offered a unique chance to watch nature write its own recovery story. Would forests return naturally? Which species would arrive first? How long would recovery take? No one knew. The mountain had become the world's largest outdoor laboratory. Eventually, a compromise emerged. Some areas would undergo cleanup and restoration, others would remain largely undisturbed for scientific research. This decision ultimately led to one of the most important conservation efforts in modern American history. In 1982, Congress established the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. Rather than attempting to restore every acre to its previous appearance, much of the blast zone would be preserved exactly as nature left it. Visitors could witness not only the destruction, but also the remarkable process of recovery. It was an unusual idea. Most national monuments celebrate beautiful landscapes already shaped by nature. This monument celebrated change itself. Its purpose was not to freeze the mountain in time. Its purpose was to watch time transform the mountain. Almost immediately, researchers began documenting astonishing discoveries. One of the first surprises involved the humble pocket gopher. These small mammals spend much of their lives underground. During the eruption, many remained safely beneath insulating layers of soil. When they emerged afterward, they unknowingly became ecological pioneers. As they dug tunnels, they mixed buried organic material into the ash covering the surface. This simple activity helped restore nutrients to the devastated ground. Tiny animals were quietly helping rebuild an entire ecosystem. Then came the plants. Most people expected forests to begin with trees. Instead, recovery started with much smaller pioneers. Lupines were among the earliest flowers to establish themselves across the ash-covered landscape. Their purple blossoms brought unexpected color to what had seemed like endless gray wasteland. More importantly, lupines enriched the soil by fixing nitrogen, creating conditions that allowed other plants to follow. Nature, it turned out, understood ecological succession far better than humans did. The insects returned next, then spiders carried by the wind, then birds, then small mammals. Streams that had looked completely lifeless gradually filled once again with aquatic insects. Fish populations slowly recovered where suitable habitat remained. Elk wandered cautiously into newly growing meadows. Every returning species changed conditions for the next. Recovery wasn't random. It followed a remarkably complex sequence. Scientists who expected ecological chaos instead witnessed ecological organization. Perhaps nowhere demonstrated this resilience more dramatically than Spirit Lake. Immediately after the eruption, many assumed the lake had died forever. Its waters were filled with ash. Millions of floating logs covered much of the surface. Oxygen levels dropped dramatically. Fish populations collapsed. The lake appeared beyond saving. Yet within only a few years, life began returning. Microorganisms adapted, aquatic plants expanded, chemical conditions gradually stabilized. Scientists realized they had underestimated nature's capacity for renewal. Spirit Lake had not escaped the eruption. It had survived it in a completely transformed form. The volcano itself also refused to remain still. Many people imagine volcanic eruptions as single explosive events followed by permanent quiet. Mount St. Helens challenged that assumption. During the months and years after May 1980, fresh lava slowly emerged inside the enormous horseshoe-shaped crater. Instead of rebuilding the lost summit immediately, the volcano constructed a series of lava domes within the crater itself. These domes rose gradually as thick magma squeezed upward like toothpaste from a tube. Some later collapsed, others grew larger. The mountain continued evolving. Its story had not ended on May 18. It had entered a new chapter. Tourism, surprisingly, also returned. At first, visitors came primarily to witness destruction. People wanted to see the flattened forests they had watched on television. Observation points filled with photographers. Scientists led educational tours. Families stood silently overlooking the crater, struggling to comprehend the scale of what had happened. Over time, however, the attraction changed. People no longer came only to see devastation, they came to witness recovery. Children who visited in the 1980s often returned decades later with children of their own. Each visit revealed another stage in nature's remarkable rebuilding process. Young forests gradually replaced open ash fields. Wildflowers spread across slopes once considered barren. Birdsong slowly returned. The mountain taught patience. Recovery, it reminded everyone, cannot be rushed. Economically, rebuilding demanded years rather than months. Federal agencies invested heavily in infrastructure. Scientists received funding for long-term ecological research. Local communities diversified their economies. While logging remained important, tourism, education, and scientific research became increasingly significant sources of income. Ironically, the eruption that had devastated the region eventually attracted visitors from around the world. People came not despite the volcano, but because of it. Today, hundreds of thousands of visitors travel to Mount St. Helens every year. Many expect to find only a disaster site. Instead, they discover one of Earth's greatest demonstrations of resilience. They see forests in different stages of recovery. They hear birds where silence once prevailed. They watch wildflowers bloom across old lava and ash. They stand before a crater that continues reminding humanity that landscapes are never truly permanent. Perhaps the greatest lesson of rebuilding Mount St. Helens is this: recovery is not the process of making everything exactly as it was before. True recovery creates something new. The forests growing today are not identical to the forests destroyed in 1980. The rivers follow different paths. Spirit Lake remains transformed. Even the mountain itself wears a different face. Yet life returned. Communities adapted. Science advanced. The region found new purpose. The eruption became not only a story of destruction, but also one of renewal. And as researchers continued studying every new flower, every returning animal, and every subtle geological change, they realized that Mount St. Helens had become far more than a volcano. It had become one of the greatest classrooms on Earth. The lessons learned there would soon travel far beyond Washington state, reshaping how scientists around the world monitored volcanoes, predicted eruptions, and prepared entire populations for disasters that had not yet happened. On the morning of May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens changed a landscape. In the years that followed, it changed a science. Long before the eruption, volcanology had existed as a respected field of geology, but it remained surprisingly young. Scientists understood many of the basic processes that created volcanoes. They knew magma rose from deep underground. They understood that pressure could build beneath a mountain. They could identify ancient lava flows and layers of volcanic ash that recorded eruptions stretching back thousands of years. But one thing remained incredibly difficult: predicting exactly what a volcano would do next. Before 1980, many volcanic studies focused on understanding the past. After Mount St. Helens, the focus shifted toward protecting the future. The eruption became one of the most carefully documented natural disasters in history. Thousands of photographs, hundreds of hours of seismic recordings, gas measurements, satellite images, eyewitness accounts, every fallen tree, every ash layer, every crack inside the volcano. Nothing seemed too small to study. Scientists recognized something extraordinary. Nature had provided them with a full-scale laboratory. Instead of examining an eruption centuries after it occurred, they could investigate one almost immediately after the event itself. Questions that had once remained theoretical suddenly had real evidence. Why had the north side collapsed? How had the lateral blast accelerated so quickly? Why did some valleys survive while neighboring ridges were completely destroyed? How far could volcanic mudflows travel? What warning signs had appeared before the eruption? The search for answers lasted years. In many ways, it still continues today. Perhaps the most important lesson involved the growing bulge on the mountain's northern side. Before the eruption, scientists knew the bulge was unusual. They measured it carefully. They watched it expand by several feet every day. Yet few fully appreciated what it represented. The bulge wasn't simply an interesting geological feature. It was the visible symptom of catastrophic structural failure. After Mount St. Helens, volcanologists around the world began paying much closer attention to changes in a volcano's shape. A mountain doesn't have to erupt dramatically to signal danger. Sometimes, the mountain itself quietly changes form. Today, scientists routinely measure volcanoes with extraordinary precision. Ground-based GPS receivers detect movements measured in fractions of an inch. Laser scanners map entire mountainsides. Radar satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth compare images taken days or weeks apart. Known as interferometric synthetic aperture radar, or INSAR, this technology allows researchers to detect subtle ground deformation across vast regions. A volcano no longer needs visible smoke to reveal its activity. Sometimes, a tiny rise in the landscape is enough to raise concern. The eruption also transformed earthquake monitoring. In 1980, seismographs around Mount St. Helens were relatively limited compared with today's networks. Researchers relied on fewer instruments and slower communication systems. Data often required careful manual interpretation. Modern volcano observatories operate very differently. Dense networks of digital seismometers continuously monitor even the faintest underground vibrations. Sophisticated software identifies earthquake swarms automatically. Patterns emerge almost instantly. Scientists receive alerts in real time. This doesn't mean eruptions have become easy to predict. Far from it. But researchers now possess vastly more information than they did during the spring of 1980. Another revolutionary change involved volcanic gases. As magma rises toward Earth's surface, dissolved gases escape from the molten rock. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, water vapor, hydrogen, sulfide. Each tells scientists something about what is happening underground. Before Mount St. Helens, gas monitoring remained relatively limited. Collecting samples often required researchers to approach dangerously close to active vents. Today, many measurements occur remotely. Specialized instruments continuously analyze volcanic gases from safe distances. Satellites even detect sulfur dioxide drifting through the atmosphere. Small drones now fly into areas once considered too dangerous for human observers. These flying laboratories collect gas samples, photograph active craters, and map terrain without risking lives. Technology has become an extension of the scientist. Perhaps nowhere is this progress more meaningful than in remembering David Johnston. His death highlighted the risks researchers sometimes accepted simply to gather information. Modern remote sensing technologies have dramatically reduced the need for scientists to place themselves directly inside hazardous zones. They still work in dangerous environments, but many observations once requiring human presence can now be made from miles away. The mountain taught science how to become safer. Mount St. Helens also reshaped hazard mapping. Before 1980, volcanic hazard maps often emphasized lava flows and falling ash. The eruption revealed that volcanoes could create dangers extending far beyond those traditional expectations. Lateral blasts, massive landslides, pyroclastic flows, lahars, each required entirely new approaches to risk assessment. Modern hazard maps now illustrate multiple possible scenarios rather than assuming a single style of eruption. Communities receive clearer guidance about which areas face different levels of risk. Emergency managers use these maps to develop evacuation plans long before crises begin. Another remarkable lesson involved communication. Scientists during the Mount St. Helens crisis possessed valuable information, but communicating uncertainty proved incredibly difficult. Many residents wanted simple answers. Will it erupt? Yes or no? Scientists rarely work that way. Nature doesn't offer certainty, it offers probabilities. The eruption demonstrated that effective disaster communication requires more than accurate science. It requires public trust. Today, volcano observatories devote enormous effort to explaining changing conditions in language the public can understand. Color-coded alert systems help simplify complex situations. Regular briefings reduce confusion. Scientists work closely with emergency managers, government officials, and news organizations to ensure consistent messaging. This collaboration represents one of the eruption's lasting legacies. Volcanology became not only a scientific discipline, but also a communication discipline. The influence of Mount St. Helens soon spread beyond the Pacific Northwest. In Alaska, where dozens of active volcanoes threaten air travel, monitoring networks expanded dramatically. The Alaska Volcano Observatory incorporated many lessons first highlighted during 1980. Today, it continuously monitors volcanoes whose ash clouds could disrupt international aviation routes across the North Pacific. Thousands of flights benefit from systems whose development accelerated after Mount St. Helens in Hawaii. Researchers studying Klauia and Mauna Loa integrated new monitoring techniques into their observatories. Although Hawaiian volcanoes typically erupt far differently from Mount St. Helens, the principles of continuous observation, rapid communication, and detailed hazard planning proved universally valuable. Across the world, scientists took notice. Japan strengthened monitoring around its numerous active volcanoes. Indonesia expanded volcanic surveillance across one of the world's most volcanically active archipelagos. Iceland improved cooperation between volcanologists and aviation authorities. Italy continued refining hazard planning for Mount Vesuvius and Mount Etna. The lessons crossed oceans because volcanoes ignore national borders. Every eruption teaches humanity, not merely one country. The eruption even changed the way satellites were used. In 1980, satellite technology remained relatively young. Scientists recognized its potential, but lacked many of today's sophisticated imaging systems. Over the following decades, Earth-observing satellites became indispensable tools. Thermal cameras detect rising surface temperatures. Radar penetrates clouds to measure ground movement. High-resolution optical images document changing landscapes. Some satellites revisit the same volcano every few days, creating detailed time-lapse records impossible for earlier generations to imagine. Artificial intelligence and machine learning now assist researchers by identifying subtle patterns hidden within enormous datasets. Algorithms compare millions of seismic signals. Computer models simulate magma movement. Researchers continuously improve eruption forecasting by combining geological observations with computational power unavailable in 1980. Yet despite all this remarkable progress, one reality remains unchanged. Volcanoes continue to surprise us. Scientists today understand vastly more than they did 40 years ago. They can often recognize warning signs earlier. They can issue better hazard assessments. They can monitor mountains almost continuously. But no instrument can read a volcano's mind. Every volcano possesses its own personality. Some produce gentle lava flows, others unleash catastrophic explosions. Many alternate between different behaviors over centuries. Forecasting an eruption remains one of the most difficult problems in Earth science. Mount St. Helens reminded researchers to approach nature with humility. Confidence is valuable. Overconfidence is dangerous. Perhaps the most profound scientific lesson had little to do with technology. It involved collaboration. The eruption brought together geologists, hydrologists, meteorologists, ecologists, engineers, chemists, biologists, emergency managers, military personnel, government agencies, universities. No single discipline possessed every answer. Understanding the volcano required many perspectives working together. That interdisciplinary approach has since become standard practice for disaster science around the world. Today, when signs of volcanic unrest appear, teams of specialists immediately begin sharing data rather than working in isolation. Mount St. Helens helped build a culture of cooperation. Its influence reaches beyond volcanoes. Modern responses to hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, wildfires, and even disease outbreaks increasingly rely upon coordinated networks of experts communicating rapidly across institutions. One mountain quietly transformed how science itself operates. Visitors standing before Mount St. Helens today often notice the recovering forests, the enormous crater, and the floating logs upon Spirit Lake. What they cannot easily see are the invisible legacies. The satellites passing overhead, the monitoring stations quietly recording earthquakes, the GPS receivers measuring tiny movements, the computers analyzing streams of data every second, the emergency plans waiting in county offices, the scientists trained using lessons first learned here. All of these represent part of the mountain's legacy. Ironically, one of America's greatest scientific classrooms emerged from one of its greatest natural disasters. The eruption claimed lives that can never be replaced. It destroyed landscapes that will never return exactly as they once were. Yet from that tragedy came knowledge that has almost certainly saved lives around the world. Warnings arrive earlier. Hazard maps are better. Evacuation decisions are more informed. Communication is clearer. Technology is stronger. None of these developments erase what happened in 1980, but they honor it. because every lesson learned from Mount St. Helens carries forward the hope that future communities will have more time, more information, and more opportunities to reach safety before the Earth once again reminds humanity that beneath even the most peaceful mountains, enormous forces never truly sleep. But for now, let the instruments fall silent and the mountain rest beneath the stars. Imagine a cool evening breeze moving gently through young forests that have slowly reclaimed the slopes. The scientists have packed away their notebooks, the helicopters are gone, and only the quiet sounds of nature remain. Breathe slowly, letting each breath become calmer than the last. There is nowhere else you need to be. Let your thoughts drift as peacefully as the clouds above the crater, and if sleep comes softly now, allow it to carry you into the stillness of the mountain night. On a clear day, Mount St. Helens looks almost peaceful once more. The forests are green again. Wildflowers bloom across slopes that once appeared permanently lifeless. Hikers pause at scenic overlooks to admire the enormous horseshoe-shaped crater. Children point excitedly toward steam, occasionally rising from vents deep inside the volcano. Photographers once again wait for sunrise, hoping to capture the mountain glowing beneath the first light of morning. To someone visiting for the first time, it can be difficult to imagine the violence that unfolded here in 1980. Nature has a remarkable ability to soften the scars of its own disasters. Grass grows over old landslides, trees hide broken landscapes. Rivers carve new paths that eventually feel ancient. Given enough time, destruction slowly begins to resemble beauty once again. Yet beneath Mount St. Helens, the same geological engine continues operating. The Juan de Fuca plate has not stopped sliding beneath North America. Magma still forms deep underground. Earth's crust remains under constant pressure. The volcano did not die in 1980, it changed. In fact, Mount St. Helens reminded everyone of this reality only 24 years later. In 2004, scientists noticed something familiar: small earthquakes, steam emissions, subtle changes inside the crater. For anyone who remembered the events of 1980, the reports immediately captured attention. Was the mountain preparing for another catastrophic eruption? News organizations quickly returned. Scientists activated monitoring systems. Local residents watched carefully. Fortunately, the story unfolded very differently. Instead of another enormous explosion, Mount St. Helens began slowly building new lava domes inside the crater created during the 1980 eruption. For several years, thick magma gradually pushed upward, adding fresh volcanic rock without producing a major explosive event. The eruption confirmed something important: the volcano remained active. But active does not always mean catastrophic. Volcanoes behave in many different ways. Some eruptions are gentle, others are devastating. The challenge is knowing which type is coming. That uncertainty naturally leads to one question: could the 1980 disaster happen again? The answer is both simple and complicated. Yes, Mount St. Helens will almost certainly erupt again someday. Scientists are remarkably confident about that, not because they possess a crystal ball, but because geological history makes the conclusion unavoidable. Over thousands of years, Mount St. Helens has erupted many times. Its quiet periods have often lasted decades or centuries before activity resumed. In geological terms, 40 or 50 years is only a brief pause. The more difficult question is this: when? No one knows. It could happen years from now, decades from now, perhaps not within our lifetimes, perhaps sooner than anyone expects. Volcanoes operate according to geological clocks rather than human calendars. Fortunately, The United States now watches Mount St. Helens more closely than almost any volcano on Earth. A network of modern instruments surrounds the mountain. Sensitive seismometers detect tiny earthquakes too small for people to feel. GPS receivers measure ground movement with astonishing precision. Gas monitoring equipment analyzes changes in volcanic emissions. Satellite radar detects subtle swelling or sinking of the landscape. Remote cameras provide continuous visual observations. Scientists receive information around the clock. If the volcano begins changing, researchers will almost certainly notice long before casual observers do. This represents one of the greatest legacies of 1980. The eruption transformed surprise into surveillance. Yet Mount St. Helens is not the only volcano capable of threatening the Pacific Northwest. Far to the north rises another giant, Mount Rainier. Standing over 14,000 feet tall, Rainier dominates the skyline around Seattle and Tacoma. Its snow-covered summit appears majestic, but beneath that beauty lies one of America's greatest natural hazards. Unlike Mount St. Helens, the greatest danger from Mount Rainier may not even be a large eruption. It is the enormous amount of ice covering the volcano. Rainier holds more glaciers than any other peak in the contiguous United States. If volcanic heat or structural collapse rapidly melted that ice, massive lahars could race through river valleys at highway speeds. Entire communities now stand where those mudflows have traveled many times in the distant past. More than 100,000 people live within valleys historically shaped by volcanic mudflows from Mount Rainier. Unlike the sparsely populated areas surrounding Mount St. Helens in 1980, Rainier's hazard zone contained cities, schools, hospitals, businesses, and major transportation corridors. The volcano's quiet appearance hides an extraordinary level of risk. Fortunately, communities surrounding Mount Rainier prepare constantly. Evacuation routes are clearly marked. Schools conduct drills. Warning sirens stand ready. Emergency managers regularly review response plans. The lessons learned from Mount St. Helens continue protecting lives decades later. Farther south stands Mount Hood. Overlooking Portland, Oregon, to many residents, Hood is simply part of the skyline, a familiar landmark, a popular destination for skiing and hiking. Yet Mount Hood is also an active volcano. Its last significant eruptive period occurred only a few centuries ago. Geologists continue monitoring it carefully. Then there is Mount Shasta in northern California, Mount Baker near the Canadian border, Lassen Peak, whose eruptions in the early 20th century served as one of the few modern American volcanic experiences before Mount St. Helens. The Cascade Range contains more than a dozen major volcanoes. Most remain quiet. But quiet is not the same as extinct. Perhaps no American volcanic location generates more public curiosity than Yellowstone. The word itself has become almost synonymous with disaster scenarios on the internet. Videos and headlines frequently warn about an impending supervolcano. Some claim civilization could end overnight. Others suggest scientists are hiding imminent danger. The reality is far less dramatic and far more reassuring. Yellowstone is indeed one of Earth's largest volcanic systems. It has produced enormous eruptions in the distant geological past. But those eruptions occurred hundreds of thousands of years apart. Today, Yellowstone is continuously monitored by one of the world's most sophisticated scientific networks. The region experiences thousands of small earthquakes each year, but these are normal for such an active geothermal system. Scientists see no evidence that Yellowstone is preparing for a catastrophic eruption anytime soon. In fact, researchers often explain that the greatest hazards facing Yellowstone visitors today are far more ordinary: hot springs, geysers, wildlife, weather, not an imminent super-eruption. Mount St. Helens taught an important lesson about volcanoes and public perception. People often worry about the wrong mountains. Dramatic internet stories capture attention. Quiet scientific monitoring rarely does. Real volcanic hazards require careful observation rather than sensational predictions. Another major change since 1980 involves population growth. The Pacific Northwest has expanded dramatically over the past 4 decades. Seattle has grown into one of America's leading technology centers. Portland has continued expanding. Smaller communities throughout Washington and Oregon have welcomed hundreds of thousands of new residents. Many of these newcomers admire the region's mountains without realizing they are living within an active volcanic arc. Ironically, beautiful scenery continues attracting people toward geological hazards. The same forces that built spectacular landscapes also created the risks beneath them. Emergency planners understand this reality well. Modern volcanic preparedness extends far beyond scientists. Schools participate in evacuation exercises. County governments maintain emergency communication systems. Transportation agencies develop traffic management plans. Hospitals prepare for mass casualty events. Meteorologists coordinate ash cloud forecasts. Air traffic controllers communicate with pilots. Power companies review infrastructure vulnerabilities. One lesson from Mount St. Helens became unmistakably clear. Disaster response cannot begin after the eruption starts. Preparation must happen years beforehand. Technology has certainly improved. But some limitations remain. Scientists still cannot predict the exact day and hour of most volcanic eruptions. Nature remains too complex. Underground magma behaves differently beneath each volcano. Every eruption writes its own story. Researchers can often identify increasing danger. They can estimate probabilities. They can recommend evacuations, but certainty remains beyond reach. That uncertainty frustrates many people, yet perhaps it should inspire respect instead. Mount St. Helens demonstrated that the Earth remains an active planet. Its mountains are not statues carved from stone. They are living geological systems continuously changing beneath our feet. Most of those changes occur far too slowly for humans to notice. Occasionally, however, centuries of quiet end within minutes. The story of Mount St. Helens also raises a broader question. How well prepared is modern America for rare but catastrophic natural disasters? The answer is encouraging in some ways. Warning systems are better, communication is faster, emergency planning is more sophisticated, scientific understanding has advanced enormously, yet challenges remain. Infrastructure has expanded into hazard-prone areas, population density has increased, modern supply chains depend heavily upon transportation networks vulnerable to disruption. Air travel can be interrupted by distant ash clouds. Electrical grids, internet connections, highways, railroads, and ports all depend upon functioning infrastructure. A major eruption today would unfold within a society more technologically advanced than that of 1980. But it would also unfold within a society more interconnected and therefore potentially more vulnerable to widespread disruption. This realization extends beyond volcanoes. Hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, floods, every major natural disaster asks the same question. Have we learned enough from the last one? Mount St. Helens suggests that learning never truly ends. Every generation inherits both knowledge and responsibility. Knowledge from those who studied the mountain. Responsibility to continue paying attention when nature begins whispering its warnings again. Today, visitors standing before the crater often experience conflicting emotions. They admire the beauty. They remember the tragedy. They marvel at the recovering forests, and they quietly wonder what lies beneath the mountain's peaceful surface. That question has no final answer, because the earth itself has not finished writing the story. Somewhere deep below the Cascade Range, magma continues moving through ancient pathways. Pressure slowly changes. Rock gradually shifts. The mountain remains patient. Human beings count time in years. Mountains count it in millennia. One day, whether decades from now or centuries into the future, Mount St. Helens will almost certainly awaken once more. The warning signs may look familiar. Small earthquakes, steam rising from new vents, ground slowly swelling, scientists installing instruments, emergency meetings, road closures, questions without certain answers. When that day comes, the greatest difference will not be the volcano. It will be the people watching it. Because thanks to the lessons of 1980, America will not be seeing those warning signs for the first time. The mountain already taught the nation how to listen. The only question that remains is whether future generations will remember what it said. As the first light of morning touches Mount St. Helens today, it is difficult not to pause. The sunrise is beautiful. Golden light spills across the recovering forests. The crater casts long shadows over fresh lava domes. Mist rises gently from valleys where rivers have quietly carved new paths through rock and ash. Birds circle above the mountain, just as they did long before 1980. Elk move through meadows that once lay buried beneath volcanic debris. Wildflowers bloom where millions of shattered trees once covered the ground. To a visitor seeing it for the first time, the mountain feels peaceful, almost gentle. It is easy to believe that it has always looked this way, but every ridge, every valley, and every young forest tells another story. A story of unimaginable destruction, a story of remarkable resilience, and above all, a story of humility. Because Mount St. Helens did not simply erupt, it changed the way America understood the natural world. Before May 18, 1980, many Americans viewed volcanoes as distant curiosities. They belonged in Hawaii. They belonged in Iceland, Japan, or Indonesia. They were fascinating subjects for documentaries and geography books, but not something that could suddenly reshape life in the continental United States. Mount St. Helens shattered that illusion. It reminded an entire nation that Earth's greatest forces are never truly asleep. They simply operate on timescales far longer than our own. One human lifetime may feel long to us. To a volcano, it can be little more than a quiet afternoon. The eruption also revealed something equally important about ourselves. Human beings are extraordinary at building. We build roads through mountains. We build towns beside rivers. We build homes beneath forests. We create businesses, schools, and communities that feel permanent. We often forget that the landscapes beneath them are still evolving. The same rivers that provide water can flood. The same forests that provide timber can burn. The same mountains that inspire awe can suddenly remind us that they are still alive. Yet the story of Mount St. Helens is not ultimately one of fear. It is one of learning. Every earthquake recorded before the eruption became valuable data. Every photograph taken after the blast became part of scientific history. Every difficult decision made by emergency managers helped shape future disaster planning. Every lesson learned has echoed far beyond Washington State. Today, satellites silently watch restless volcanoes around the world. Sensitive instruments measure tiny changes invisible to the human eye. Scientists collaborate across continents within minutes instead of weeks. Pilots receive warnings before ash clouds threaten aircraft. Communities practice evacuation plans long before emergencies unfold. Students study Mount St. Helens not simply because it was destructive, but because it transformed knowledge into preparedness. In that sense, the volcano continues protecting lives decades after the eruption itself. Its greatest legacy may not be the crater it left behind, it may be the countless disasters that became less deadly because scientists remembered what happened here. There is another lesson hidden within the story, one that extends beyond volcanoes. Throughout history, civilizations have often ignored slow, inconvenient warnings. Sometimes they ignored signs of drought, sometimes signs of economic instability, sometimes political tensions, sometimes environmental change. The warnings rarely arrive all at once. They accumulate quietly. One small signal, then another, then another. Eventually, people become accustomed to them. The unusual becomes familiar. The extraordinary begins to feel ordinary. By the spring of 1980, many residents around Mount St. Helens had grown accustomed to daily earthquakes, steam explosions, and news reports. The mountain had been restless for weeks. It became increasingly easy to believe tomorrow would look like yesterday. History reminds us that this pattern repeats far beyond volcanoes. Nature whispers long before it shouts. Listening carefully often determines the difference between preparedness and surprise. At the same time, Mount St. Helens teaches an equally powerful lesson about resilience. The eruption flattened forests that had grown for centuries. Many believed recovery would take generations. Some assumed parts of the mountain would remain barren forever. Nature disagreed. The first flowers returned, then insects, then birds, then elk, then forests. Life quietly rebuilt itself, not exactly as before, but in entirely new ways. Human communities followed a similar path. Roads returned, businesses reopened. Scientists established one of the world's greatest natural laboratories. Visitors came not only to witness destruction, but to witness renewal. The mountain that once symbolized catastrophe gradually became a symbol of resilience. Perhaps that is why millions of people continue visiting Mount St. Helens today. They come expecting to see the scars. Instead, they discover hope. Hope growing one tree at a time, one flower at a time, one generation at a time. Standing on an overlook above the crater today, it is impossible not to feel small. Not in an uncomfortable way, in an honest way. The mountain reminds us that humanity is incredibly capable. We build remarkable technologies. We send spacecraft beyond our solar system. We map distant galaxies. We communicate instantly across continents. Yet beneath all of that progress, we remain part of a living planet whose story began billions of years before our own. That realization is not discouraging. It is grounding. It reminds us that wisdom begins with respect. Respect for the landscapes we inhabit. Respect for the science that seeks to understand them. Respect for the people willing to dedicate their lives to protecting others. And respect for the quiet warnings that nature sometimes offers before revealing its full power. The story of Mount St. Helens did not end in 1980. It continues every day. Every earthquake recorded beneath the Cascade Range. Every student inspired to study geology. Every emergency drill practiced in a school near an active volcano. Every satellite image sent back to researchers. Every visitor standing silently before the crater. Each becomes another chapter in the mountain's ongoing story. Because volcanoes do not simply belong to history, they belong to the future as well. One day, Mount St. Helens will awaken again. No one knows whether that day will arrive years from now or centuries into the future. But when it does, Scientists will recognize the warning signs more quickly. Communities will prepare more effectively. Emergency managers will respond with lessons written in ash more than 4 decades ago. The mountain will still be powerful. Humanity, however, will be wiser. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy any disaster can leave behind. As the sun climbs higher over the Cascades, the morning silence returns. The forests sway gently in the breeze. A bald eagle glides across the valley. The waters of Spirit Lake shimmer beneath the growing light, still carrying silent reminders of the eruption that changed them forever. The mountain stands quietly once again, patient, watchful, neither friend nor enemy, simply following the rhythms of a restless planet. For now, it sleeps. But its story continues to echo through science, through history, and through every person who pauses to look at its broken summit and remembers that even the strongest mountains can change in a single morning. And perhaps, if we continue listening to the lessons it left behind, we will remember that the greatest gift nature sometimes gives us is not certainty. It is a warning. The question, now as it was in the spring of 1980, is whether we choose to hear it